Hello and welcome to Silex, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg. And that's the last one in Luxembourg, because remember, we are switching into a European podcast. But today in Luxembourg, in a way, because our researcher, our guest today is actually a person who was visiting Luxembourg just a few months ago. And now she is back in her home country. So who am I talking about? I'm talking about Professor Catia Batista, who is a professor of economics at the Nova School of Business and Economics, where she's also founder and scientific director of the Nova Africa Research Center. She holds a PhD in economics from the Department of Economics of the University of Chicago, and she was visiting here, Luxembourg, at LISER, thanks to the Intermobility program of the FNR. Katia, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Okay, we are going to be a bit serious today because the subject of your studies is actually pretty serious. I don't know whether we will manage to get a bit of humor in there, I hope as well. But let's start with the serious stuff. So, what does it mean for you, for an economist, to study migration?
My view is that the ultimate focus of economics is people and increasing people's well-being. And in this regard, international migration is growingly an important phenomenon. I think these days, everyone recognizes that international migration is one of the most critical issues in terms of public policies. But I guess I actually started working on this topic about 20 years ago, and I could already relate to the importance of these movements of people, both for countries of origin and countries of destination. Also, in economics, the first questions about international migration were related to the impact of people coming into the economy, mostly. I mean, people were always afraid that when you have people from other origins that are different from you, they are coming and they are going to steal your jobs and decrease your wages, right? That is the classical question. That's not the first question that I dealt with. The other question or the other topic that people always thought about was migration is good at the origin because it brings financial remittances. So those are the classic topics in economics. I actually think those are not the most interesting ones. And these days, the work that I've been doing both in countries of destination and origin has more to do, for example, with the question of brain drain and brain gain for the countries of origin. I mean, I think this is a big debate, not only for low-income countries, but for many rich countries where we see many of our best educated young people leaving the country. And there is always a public debate about how detrimental this could be for the economy and society of these countries. And so a lot of my research has been examining the consequences of the emigration and the emigration of the highly skilled for the economy and the society of these countries of origin. And actually the message, I think, is quite positive in the sense that there are many potential positive gains from these out movements of people. Okay, because when people are abroad, if they keep in contact with those that are back home, they can positively influence this development. And this is what we call the immaterial remittances, as opposed to the financial one. It's not about money. Okay, so money is important. Of course, it can finance new ideas, new businesses. But when people go abroad, they actually contact with different environments. And this diversified experience many times prompts new ideas for development. For example, in terms of political norms and behaviors and demand for better governance, all of these more political and cultural remittances, if you will, can positively impact countries of origin. And we know institutions are hugely important for economic development. It is also documented, for example, the transmission of gender equality norms. We know also in terms of skills, to open businesses, to do better businesses. This is also very documented. So migrants can positively impact their country of origin, be it through, returning with new skills and maybe some savings, financial savings that allow them to open new businesses. But it can also happen while people stay away, diaspora. The diaspora effects are sometimes very positive because people can, through their friendship networks, for example, they can influence what is happening back home in a positive way. They have connections with people in other countries. They will bring foreign direct investment. They will bring international trade relations, promoting exports. So there are many potentially positive gains for countries of origin from migration. And so these type of questions that are not obvious but that are best addressed by economists that have the frameworks to encompass these different moving parts. This is really what drives me, what motivates me, and where I hope I'm able to do well, my small bit of contribution.
And it also means talking to the decision makers. And I think you're really at the heart of the problem of talking to politicians, in the sense that this is really basically the first topic of emotional debate, of fear, of really you providing facts and data and the politicians saying, yeah, but that's not what people feel.
Absolutely. And that's always a work in progress. So that's why science communication is so important, because our role as researchers is to find the most rigorous possible evidence on which policymakers can get support for their decisions. But there is obviously a tension. And these days, where we have so many populist movements that rely on people's fears, or that rely on these zero-sum thinking, which is this idea that has been developed a lot lately, that there is always someone winning and losing from international relations. And this applies to international trade, this applies to international migration. And what we know with our evidence is that, well, in these specific cases, that does not tend to be the case. What you may have is some kind of redistribution, but all of these needs to be documented. So we need to have evidence, and the evidence, it cannot be simplistic. It's much easier to do this simplistic discourse based on fear. I think our role as researchers is to provide evidence that is rigorous and that is a bit more complex than the simple explanations on which these politics of fear rely.
Can we actually generalize? Because, there have been so many different waves of migration. I also watched the video where you're talking about the first time Ukrainians started migrating, right? This is, again, a different reason, different way of preparation, not preparation, cultural differences, all this, right? Can you as a researcher say, okay, when there are people migrating, that's what we should do?
No, that's precisely why I was saying that we cannot be simplistic. So I can give you on average, immigrants coming to a destination country are positive to that country. But then I have to go deeper, right? Because it is true. On average, if we look at the movements of people coming into a new country, especially over time, the effects are positive. The effects, and by this I mean the economic effects. But then we need to get into the nuances. And that is why it is so important that whenever we are looking at a specific event, we try to isolate mechanisms. Why do the effects happen? How are they happening? The key message that I want to convey is, yes, you really need to look and to take into account the characteristics of migrants coming in. One well-established fact, for example, even just for economic migrants, is that the level of qualifications that migrants have are very important determinants of the impact they will have on the economy at destination. We know that when people are very highly educated, they integrate much more easily, and they are very good complements to other skilled workers. And so this is the type of migration that we know is particularly beneficial, because people come with high qualifications, they work with other high qualified people with different experiences. And from this diversity, you tend to have lots of ideas. People also bring connections from other countries, which help make good use of these skills. And this spreads to the whole society. So what we know is that highly skilled people coming in increase productivity and wages of the country. And this trickles down to even people in the destination country that are not so highly skilled. On the other hand, we have evidence also, again, average for economic migrants, that when they are less skilled, they still bring benefits, but the benefits are more in terms of getting the economy becomes more dynamic. So you can get sectors of activity where no one would work to keep working. And so again, talking about average effects, the average effect is still positive, but not as positive as the more highly qualified. So one thing that is very important here, for example, is this education, the skill profile with which people come in. But then you were talking about a very important point, which is refugees. But refugees are by nature very different from economic migrants. Economic migrants are coming to improve their lives, which is a worthy goal, but it's very different from a situation in which you have asylum seekers that are fleeing away from desperate situations. Okay? That's where they are granted the refugee status. And so those situations are very different. So as you were saying, they they don't have the opportunity to prepare so much, right? We know that economic migrants, they can take years planning and getting to the decision of migrating. With refugees, typically they had to flee their countries because of war. For example, we're talking about Ukraine and Syria. There, we know that the impacts are also nuanced. But one very important thing that we can say now with some certainty after looking at these episodes is that the policy of the destination country matters a lot. When you bring in refugees and you don't allow them to work, this has been shown to be a loss. Work is one of the best ways to integrate people in a society. Okay, school for children and for the family, but work is very important. So when you bring in people and you don't allow them to work, this has been shown to be very detrimental in economic terms, in social terms, in psychological terms, because it's like you put people's lives on hold, and that is really not ideal. That's something that we know when we compare, for example, the Syrian refugees with the Ukrainian. It's true that culturally they are closer to the Western European countries that hosted these migrants. But there is another difference, which is Ukrainians were immediately allowed to work. This makes a world of difference when we look at impacts. So, I always give very long answers, but I guess the point here is that absolutely, you are right. The characteristics of those that come in, not only intrinsic characteristics or acquired like education, but also the context and the motives that bring them to the country. Okay, it's very different to look at economic migrants relative to refugees.
Of course. And going back to the economic migrants, actually, and their decisions, I think it's a good moment to ask the pub quiz question that you prepared for us. And we will only solve it at the end unless we really go that path and we discussed it earlier, but hopefully not. So listeners, remember, now Catia is going to give you the question and the answer only at the end.
This is related to work I've done on irregular migration from West Africa to Europe, which we know is extremely risky. These are the people that you see in the news drowning in the Mediterranean, trying to cross from Libya to Italy, for example. So my question here is, what do you think will happen if we go to the origin, to West Africa, and we tell people about the extreme risks they are about to face? According to best numbers, okay, which are always an approximation, 1 out of 3 people that attempt this route die in the way. So the question here is, what do you think happens when we go and we tell these potential migrants about these numbers?
And the answer only at the end of the podcast. You mentioned a little bit your methods, so I actually wanted to discuss that, right? Because, again, my lay perspective on economics, the discussions in the beginning of economics and whatever, I always had the feeling it's a little bit, the world is here and then there are the indicators. It's a little bit like it did not necessarily take into consideration the emotional part or the irrational part of human beings, right? And all that. But I know that you do a lot of field work, right? So what are the methods that you actually apply?
I apply a lot of experimental methods. And the reason for that is that cold economies that you describe, we want to be as precise as we can when we form policymakers. Okay? So that's the goal. Now, to do this properly, we need to look at people that have emotions and thoughts, and that we cannot always predict in our mathematical models, which is the tools that we use. So the kind of work that I do tends to bring us to the field, to direct contact with the potential beneficiaries of the policies we work with. So what I tend to do is randomized control trials. So exactly the same method that we use to test new medications or immunizations. So where we have randomly chosen people that get the medicine, so that is a treatment group, and we compare them to the randomly chosen people that do not get the medicine or the policy, which are the control group. Okay. And so we follow them over time to understand what happens. So we have an idea of a policy that can be related to migration or development, or any social policy in a high income country. And we want to know how will this affect people's behaviors. And for that purpose, what we typically do, just to describe the whole process, we start obviously with hypotheses, well-grounded on existing literature and knowledge. But then before implementing policies, we try to do some qualitative work, focus groups, trying to actually talk to people to make sure that the existing evidence is minimally aligned to the people's reactions that we see. And so that's usually how we start. And then oftentimes what I do in my research is that instead of jumping to a full scale RCT with the many thousands of people in my sample, I often do lab in the field experiments. Okay, so exactly a more small scale experiments with a few hundreds of people. This gives us enough scale to have statistically valid results, but also allows us to experiment a lot with different versions of the policies we want to evaluate. We often do that. I'm trying to think of an example that does not give us the answer to our question because I have one. So that is one approach. And then what we do is like the full scale RCT, where we actually go to, say, hundreds of villages to test policies and the thousands of people, so that we really have the scale that we need to measure mechanisms. Okay, because again, we don't just want to assert that, well, we researchers have this exogenous cause, this exogenous policy that we give, and then we see the result coming out. We believe this is a bit too simplistic, because then where will we apply these results, right? The question of external validity. And so because we want to learn as much as possible from this effort, which takes a lot of effort and funding also, because we need to be in contact. We have to have large research teams that are in contact with people, have these long surveys. So for all of these to be worth it, what we do is we don't just measure the cause and the effect, ultimate, but we want to measure mechanisms. So we have a very detailed questionnaires. Sometimes we have survey experiments in the middle of the measurement to try and ascertain better how things are happening. And this is what will then allow us to transfer the knowledge we are producing to other contexts. Because we may find that some mechanism only works, say, with more skilled people, for example. And then we'll know that if we go to a different context where people are less skilled, maybe this does not apply. So at least it raises the caveats to the study and the limits to its applicability in other contexts. So this is very, very dry methodological description. I hope it makes sense.
No, absolutely. And it's very interesting as well. In the podcast, we try to also discuss methods, because it's one of the things that I want to show people interested in other fields, because we are comparing apples and pears, obviously, recently I had an astrophysicist, and there is a microbiome specialist. This is completely different story, but at the same time, there is something at heart of it. And these are the methods we are using. And of course, not everyone is great at statistics. Not pinpointing anyone, but in general, that's what we have to discuss, because I think it shows also the meat of your research, let's say. But as you said, examples. So you mentioned in the beginning already the idea of brain drain and brain gain, and I know that you studied quite a lot of that. So tell us, what did you find out? And it's pretty much against all the newspaper discourse and the literature, right?
Yeah, and more relevant, the international policymakers, because
exactly,
we still see among international policymakers this prior, without looking at evidence, that whenever you see highly educated people leaving a country, that is a brain drain, that is harmful for the country. And that is where we have been trying to work. This hypothesis is there from the 60s, 1960s, so older than us. And so people already at that time were putting forward this very pessimistic paradigm by which people leaving, it's always bad. Okay, so that has been there for a long time. Now, in the 1990s, we had the first theories proposing that, well, actually, there could be good sides to it. And so the theoretical hypothesis runs like this. So the idea is that when you see educated people leaving a country, those left behind that are still making their educational decisions might be looking and thinking, well, the possibility of emigration is actually raising the return to my education. Maybe I want to invest more in education because I may want to go away and live and have that experience of international migration. And in the end, so people invest more in education, you have more people getting education, but then only a few decide to emigrate. And the net effect is that you have more educated people back in the country than those that you would have if there had been no migration to start with. And so this is what we call the brain gain, which is this positive incentive effect on education. People will acquire more education because of the possibility of migration, even if it eventually does not realize, it does not happen. And so the net effect will be positive. Yes.
But it may mean you have more IT specialists. Do you need 20,000 more IT specialists in the home country?
That is a very good question. I think IT is not a good example because, yes, you do.
I don't know. Looking at the changes right now, it might not be the job of the future. But yes, I know what you mean.
I mean, on that, I'm also optimistic because I think, of course, it's a big debate on how we use AI, but it can be put to good purpose and we still need the people to know how to make the best use of it. So I'm positive on that one too. But anyways, so.
Or nurses, if you prefer, nurses are a good example too.
Nurses are also important, but yes, so the key question here, or there are several policy questions here. One is, and this applies especially to lower income countries, is the capacity of the country to educate more people. If you have very scarce resources, maybe you don't have the capacity to enlarge the scale of your educational production. And so that is a very important policy implication. So if countries, origin countries, especially the low income ones, are to reap the rewards from the brain gain, you need to have resources invested in the educational infrastructure. And then the point that you are making, which is the potential mismatch between the country's needs and the destination needs. And so I think IT, health sectors may not be the best ones, but maybe, I mean, if you're looking at something very specific, it could be the case that you are training people on skills that are not really valuable at the origin. So that can happen. If we just say IT, I don't think it gives a proper measure. But if it is very advanced industries, for example, that are not present at the origin, then, okay, everyone will have to emigrate to get the job, and then this positive effect is lost. So the matching of the education you have in the country and the skills that are demanded abroad is for sure an important one.
But there is also one more thing. So not only the fact that most of the people will stay, most probably, but as you mentioned already, remittance. So the idea that you're sending money back, right? And that can also be positive, not only for consumption, as we used to think.
Yes, absolutely. So I was just mentioning this more surprising effect, let's put it that way, of this incentive brain gain effect, but there are many other potential positive effects. So I mentioned before the possibility of positive changes in terms of, say, your politics, your social norms, your business creation, international relations. So all of this is very well documented in the literature. Okay. So it's not deterministic. It does not always happen, but it has happened in many different contexts. But then there is this effect of financial remittances. This is something that people traditionally regarded as positive because they thought, okay, it can develop the financial system. People will be less subject to poverty. So the consumption effect. But the evidence we have shows that actually remittances are much more useful than that. Okay, remittances are most often used to finance education. Okay, so again, we have this complementary effect in which when you have migrants abroad and they send money back home, typically they are spent on educational expenses of, say, the children of those migrants, for example, or other family members. Another thing that applies, I mean, when you are looking at, say, those years, like end of teenage years in which people start to decide whether to keep studying or go work because they need the money. Okay, this is another source. So this is very important because we know that these financial flows ensure that people don't have the distress of financial needs. And we know that is a very important determinant also of these study decisions, pursuing higher education, which can be critical for the development of the country, as we know. And so financial remittances in this way, they can finance investment in education by allowing the financial means and also to allowing people to have the peace of mind to make these decisions and to make this investment, knowing that, well, at least the basic needs are provided for.
Okay, so we have a lot of important information to consider for the policymakers, but then from that onwards, what would you say? Should we actually put in place a lot of regulation on people's mobility so that it's done according to what you're saying? Should it be free? Well, where are you on the scale?
It's not an easy question. Okay, so let's summarize like that. There are various considerations that we must have. So we know, as I started, so if we just look at average effects, immigration is good for destination countries on average, okay, with all of this discussion that we have had on the nuances. But one very important point is that these migration flows need to be supported. I do not believe that we should just open doors. I do not think this would be good for migrants or for the destination countries. Because what is very important is that you have, at least a minimum infrastructure to host these migrants. So you have to have, say, the admin services in place, the immigration services, so that people are guaranteed that all the paperwork is in place, that they can legally look for a job or work in whatever job they found. They have some support for their families. If they come from a country with a different language, they have the resources to learn and to integrate, because you cannot reap economic benefits without social integration. So I believe that, yes, there should be open doors to an extent. And this, there is no recipe to establish how much this is. But what needs to be in place in the country of destination is the critical infrastructure to support migrants at their arrival. The support does not need to be very extensive. Okay, so the different countries do it differently. But what we know is that it has to be enough so that people have the time to really integrate into society, so that they not group into very segregated networks or neighborhoods, because this is not good for them, because they won't be able to integrate, to reap the rewards of being in a different country. And it creates a lot of social and political tensions ultimately. So I believe that, yes, we should allow migrants, and this is generally positive, but we also need to do it in a way that support these people that are coming in. In a way, what I usually say, and this applies mostly to the high income Western countries, is that, we are getting old societies, right? So we know that we have a lot of needs for workers. And this means that, yes, we need people to come in. At the same time, it is more expensive for a country to open doors to people that are coming in than just to have, babies being born in the country, which would be the alternative. Even for public finances, I think it pays off to admit migrants, because typically they're already at working age, their education is done, and they are just going to contribute to your taxes and to your social security, which is a problem in most of these aging countries. So there are many benefits to be had from immigration, but you need to invest in the integration of immigrants. You need to have regulated flows so that you can reap these rewards.
Getting back to details, what about migrating researchers? I was recently in Brussels, and there was a discussion, of course, choose Europe and branding it as Europe as the destination for researchers and all that. And you've just come back from Luxembourg. So how is it on migration when it comes to research, and how was Luxembourg?
Well, I think that falls into the first category of migration that I was describing, which is the most positive one, where people, the fact that we are fortunate to be able to go to different countries, meet other researchers. This gives us new ideas, new energy for research when you are in one place in the other. So I truly believe this is highly productive. I believe Europe has an opportunity when we see policies such as the ones enacted by the United States, which are currently being discussed. I know it has not been set in stone or in law, but all of these discussions that US is having that are basically threatening science in that region of the world, I think this is a huge opportunity for Europe. I just hope that we have the capacity to seize it. And that's the short message. But I truly believe this is highly productive from my personal experience, but also from, even the experience that I have here in Portugal. So in our school, most of my colleagues here are from other countries. So in my research center, out of 20 research, I think we are 2 Portuguese, and all the others are coming from different parts of the world, lots of Europe, and many also from outside. And I think this is a paradigm that serves us well. It requires investment again. So we need to have the infrastructure to support researchers that are moving internationally. But I think this is the easiest type of migration.
Yes, true. That's why I said detail, but very specific detail if you want, right? But then again, migration, what was surprising to me, I was reading about changes at your school that you mentioned that there is the module of studying international migration for business. And that was surprising to me. I don't know whether that's a common thing or not, but, I would think that this is not the first module that people do if they study business.
It's true, but well, that's what I teach, right? So let's do the disclaimer. I'm very biased here. The truth is, so this is a module that I was encouraged to teach. It's open to economics students, but also to business students, finance students, and I have lots of them in my class. So we are also a very international school, and these are mostly European students. So most of our students are actually German. Many Italian as well, Portuguese, and many other European nationalities mostly. And all of these students have an international ethos. Okay, we are talking about Europe, so this is where you really see Europe at work. So these students many of them these days don't want to leave Europe, but they want to keep moving within Europe. And so they are extremely curious about this. They know that the attraction of talent is key for the success of any business. And so what we teach in this course is the motivations for people to move countries, what they need to adapt, this discussion about integration policies, for example. And then at the same time, these good business students that also study economics and politics, they realize that the environment in which business operates is highly constrained by whatever societal environment and political environment they face. And so I think, the students, when they demand these kind of courses, it's exactly because they want to understand better the world we live in, and international migration is critical for any international enterprise. And that's the aim of all these students, I guess.
Well, of course, and taking better decisions. So I guess talking of better decisions, it's the time to go back to the pub quiz question, which was very surprising, right? So taking decisions, informed decisions, and what do people decide on? Some statistics are pretty awful, to be honest. So if you can remind our listeners what the question was about and then tell us the answer.
This question is about this very grim statistic that tells us that 1 out of 3 people that attempt to migrate irregularly from West Africa to Europe, so taking this route that takes them to the Sahara Desert and go to Libya and then cross to Italy. So 1 out of 3 of them die in the way. And so this was a project that I did a few years ago, and our motivation was, and I did work together with a local researcher who was my doctoral student at the time and who was originally from one of these areas. And our prior was, we must tell people about these risks because, well, that's what we all think. So if we are to tell them about these mortality rates, they surely will think twice before they try it. But then when we got there and we started doing our systematic surveys, what we learned was that they actually had prior beliefs that 1 out of 2 of them trying this route would die. And this meant that for them, if we were to tell them that the risk was actually lower than what they thought before, they would migrate in higher numbers. And I should say that it was truly shocking for us to understand that these young males, so these were young men aged from age 15 to 25, many of them are very young. So they are so desperate to live that 60%, that is more than half of these young men, were willing to try this route, even though they thought that 1 out of 2 of them would die in the way. So it is truly dramatic, and it tells us about the strong drive, the strong motivation for these people to live. And of course, we have to understand this in a context, which is a context in which they are living still in areas. So these were people from rural areas where there is the most incidence of irregular migration, this type of migration. And they are still living in a world of traditional agriculture, for example, very low productivity. Oftentimes they are starving. Okay. They still face this kind of environment. We have climate change, which does not make things easier in this part of the world. So this is the setting in which we see many young men really desperate to come to Europe. I guess this has to make us think about alternatives. And so that our research at that point was exactly about that. So we cannot just give this information. First, we need to give broader information. So this was, as I said before, in the methodology. So we started with the lab in the field, trying to talk to people. We also had focus groups to start with. We had this experiment, just trying to understand the role of information in people's decisions. And then we did the large experiment. In this large experiment, the policy intervention was already about providing testimonies of people that are already in Europe, that are very vulnerable and subject to exploitation, so that they don't only hear the positive sides, because what we also measured was that these young men, they also overestimated the success, the allure of coming to Europe. And so we show them the full picture. We show them that, well, actually, Europe, if you don't come with a visa that allows you to work regularly, it can be very hard. You can be subject to exploitation, for example. And then we try to think of other alternatives. I mean, of saying getting vocational training back home, because this gives you different hypotheses of getting a job back home or getting a job in Europe, but the legal job where you can really profit from your skills. We also try to encourage regional migration, which is very easy to do and where there are opportunities. And from this work, actually start other work that I'm currently starting, which is trying to see how much of a difference it makes when you allow people to specifically get training and know that you can migrate. Okay, so have legal pathways as an alternative to these awful, very risky, irregular migration routes.
And what's the reaction of local government to such studies? So, because we are looking at it from the European perspective, how we want to prepare for the migration, but what about there?
Yeah, so that is something that we always do. So I do lots of work in low-income countries. One essential aspect of our methodology, to say in a broad term, is local validation workshops. So here in the Gambia, we did it. And one of the reactions I got that was quite interesting, and that relates also to the non-economic aspects of it, was, do you know how proud a mom is when her child gets to Europe? And this is very important. This is something that we measured in our fieldwork, which is social prestige. The social prestige in these villages of someone that got to Europe, but they never know what the person is doing in Europe. They might be exploited, but if they can send even 100 euros back home, this is, in terms of social prestige, this is fantastic. Now, the drawback of this, which is terrible, really, is that when people are smuggled into Libya, and they cannot cross the Mediterranean, sometimes they are being subject to, again, very exploitative conditions, and they never go back, because the bottom of the social scale, the worst social stigma is for those that try to emigrate and that fails. It's very hard on people. And so these are the things that you learn. I mean, we already knew that a bit from our work, but the reactions I got locally, and we had policymakers, we had journalists, local academics, was, well, I don't see in your study that you are valuing enough the pride that the mother feels when the son gets to Europe. But of course, I mean, we have some answers to that, which is, what about all of those that die in the way, that could be very talented, that could make their mom proud, but they just died in the way because they had no alternative. On these, I think the policymakers are quite aligned. Okay, so obviously all policymakers in RG countries want their citizens to be able to have a legal pathway to a safe journey that can be productive and that can make life better. I think here there is no really contradiction. On other dimensions, for example, these ones that we discussed on brain drain, brain gain. Do countries really benefit from their most highly educated citizens leaving? There you can have some debate. And again, in different contexts, you might have different results. But these more fundamental migration routes where lives are put at risk, I don't think there is a big debate. I think we are all very much aligned on the goals.
Yes, of course. And again, we're basically circling back to the beginning of our discussion, which is the emotional part, right? That you cannot really quantify. And how do you compare this to other different indicators you get there, right? What is more valuable? Because it's a human being you're talking about. And if there's the pride and the whole idea of being basically lost in this circle, right?
Some of my colleagues, especially in behavioral economics, do work on getting more precise measurements. But I think even in our work where we are not measuring that directly, what we have is we are very keen on measure people's behaviors in reactions to policies, which are obviously governed by a whole range of emotions. And so I would say that is not absent. We surely do not try to put values into that. I don't think that makes sense, but that is surely part of the mechanisms that are underlying the effects that we measure as rigorously as possible, and that we try to tackle when we have these discussions on mechanisms.
Okay, it's very clear right now. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for sharing this small part only of your research, because I have a few more questions here, but I don't think we'll manage today. So we'll keep it for next time. Hopefully you'll come back to Luxembourg, maybe, who knows?
I'm counting on that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Catia, for today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us. Remember, we're on Patreon. You can support us there. And of course, you can suggest guests and reach out. We're on all the social media. This was Silex, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.